Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 24th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO and Managing Partner at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Vidya Murthy at MedCrypt and Tim Sandberg at Galen for a discussion on the business case for cybersecurity in medical devices. Main topics we'll be covering today are budgeting for cybersecurity, systemic nature of cybersecurity risk, and the cost of delaying cybersecurity as patient safety. But first, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. Built on 40 plus years of collective experience developing compliance systems in the medical device industry, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timelines. So that being said, I'd like to welcome our guests, Vidya Murthy and Tim Sandberg. Vidya has worked in security for 15 years with an emphasis on healthcare and medical devices for the last 8. She has an MBA from Wharton and worked at several medical device companies, including Becton Dickinson, has supported more than 70 device manufacturers, and is the current COO of MedCrypt. Tim Sandberg has over 20 years of experience working in the information technology for medical device companies. Tim's area of focus has been validating COTS software for intended use within organizations, as well as managing enterprise applications both on premises and migrating them to cloud-based data centers. Tim has worked at OrthoExcel. I'm not even going to attempt that one, Tim. I'll let you explain it. Cyberonics, which is now LivaNova, and is currently the VP of IT operations at Galen Data. So with that being said, Tim, Vidya, the virtual stage is now yours, and I will go on mute.
Thanks, Dwayne. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending our webinar today. I'm going to jump right in here, talk about some cybersecurity statistics. So cybersecurity, security in healthcare, huge problem. In 2020, there were 599 security breaches, up 55% from the year before, which impacted 26 million patient records. That's a pretty huge number. So the risks of that, obviously loss of data, loss of system availability, hacked devices, and you have a bunch of information at risk, information that's protected under HIPAA and various other laws that govern that. And of course, there's fines associated with all of that. Sophos recently surveyed over 3,500 IT managers and globally, and they found 70% suffered security incident hosting data in the public cloud. 44% considered data loss or leakage as a top security problem. 66% have misconfigured cloud services, which leaves huge vulnerabilities, particularly with the availability and ubiquity now of cloud services. A recent attack specific to the healthcare and devices, the WannaCry ransomware that was about 1.5 years ago, the Swintooth vulnerabilities, which was a little bit longer ago, but that affected a lot of different companies. A previous one that I worked for that Dwayne mentioned, OrthoExcel, the FDA was on us quite heavily about that. And then a ransomware attack in Dusseldorf, Germany, which actually resulted in a patient death. A woman was having a heart attack, and the closest hospital, which was 5 minutes away, refused to take her because all of their IT systems were shut down in a ransomware attack, and they couldn't admit any patients. And they ended up having to send her across town, which resulted in her death. These are the things that the FDA specifically are very concerned about as we move forward with more and more devices become connected to the cloud and just connected in general.
So we hop straight into kind of the stats around this, and the numbers themselves independently are pretty extraordinary. But you might be asking yourself, so what if somebody gets my blood pressure reading? What are they going to do with this data? Why does it matter? And I think the reality is, if we did just a brief threat model of kind of the healthcare ecosystem, there are a variety of actors with varying motivations to actually get into the health system. The more obvious things like your social security number and financial impact, perhaps you could deduce pretty obviously. But then there's some individual hackers that are just kind of trying to do it for the sake of seeing if they can break into a system, which we see pretty commonly, especially off of hospital wireless networks. Criminals themselves that are targeting, I think just last week, France has a health system that's currently under ransomware that they're not able to operate. Here where I am in California, we've had multiple hospitals go down because of ransomware attacks. And anyone who's received care recently, you see how automated and system-driven things are. They literally can't open the door without kind of having a systemic way to target these things. Nations and activists. This one's perhaps less obvious, but during the pandemic especially, we've seen a lot of targeting from other nations trying to either get into our health systems to prevent some current relief that's in place, or even to try to obtain IP that is residing in hospitals that they're trying to access. The last bit is around hackers for hire. Anyone who's spent some time on the dark web or even reading a bit about it, it doesn't cost much to hire someone to kind of pursue some of these criminal activities on your behalf. And it's becoming increasingly common as a business model that they're kind of following what startups do. They have a very mature kind of venture-backed equivalent where they're getting funding. And they too, as hackers who understand value for effort, are trying to maximize their impact. If you take a step back and say, well, why would they target healthcare versus the automation or the car industry or energy or anything else, right? They're not necessarily going for these IPs in particular. They're going for the weakest link and what is going to have the highest yield for the effort that they're expending. Just like any business trying to defend themselves, they too are trying to maximize what they can get. And as Tim alluded to with some of the stats, if this were its own kind of economy, it would be 12th in the world, which is pretty extraordinary when you put it in context.
Yeah, it's very big business to hack and get this information. And there's a secondary selling that information. You know, the ransomware is one, but then selling that information on the dark web is also a very profitable business.
Yeah, I actually, as an anecdote, I have a 2.5-year-old, and it didn't dawn on us until I was in this space that we should probably shut down his Social Security and lock it for credit scores, because who am I to run a credit report on a 2-year-old? That'll never happen, right? And you wouldn't know if your pediatrician got hacked, and all of a sudden, 18 years later, you're having to deal with a big mess.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's becoming increasingly common.
Yeah. Yep.
And a lot of people don't know they can do things like that. You know, there needs to be built more awareness around that, which is why we're talking to all of you today. So some of the security and privacy regulations, just as a review, I'm sure everybody on our call is well aware of everything that's out there. And things like HIPAA, high tech, GDPR, the Cloud Act in the US. A lot of our states in the US are also enacting their own laws. California has a very extensive privacy law now that is also much more strict than things like HIPAA. Just as an example, in January of this year, they enacted part of their Privacy Act mandated that every individual device has its own unique token to communicate with the cloud services, which seems pretty obvious as a best practice to do, yet they had to mandate a law to actually make people do it. And then, there's obviously several international standards, the ISO 27001, which tells you how to run data centers and maintain that data, NIST, high trust CSF, which I just want to throw in there. Galen Data's product is certified high trust on the AWS platform.
So this is an interesting thing to think about, right, with the regulators. When you look at devices in particular or healthcare in totality, you would think there'd be a single entity that really had regulatory authority over the totality of the ecosystem. The reality is that's not the case. So a lot of times you'll hear regulators talk about collaboration and how we all need to share with each other, and it'll sound like a nice to have and it's optional. But the reality is, for this to actually be effective, if you don't have collaboration between your producer of a device maker, the consumer of the device, and the patient using the device, you're really struggling to effectively have a cybersecurity strategy that's going to maintain over the lifetime of this thing. Frequently, device sellers will get their device into a hospital and then kind of say, you know what, it's out of our hands, it's on the hospital's network, that's on them to maintain. And the device regulator has basically come back and said, that's no longer a viable strategy to have. You need to have a more constructive effort from the device maker to maintain the security posture over the lifetime of the device. And that's kind of exactly what this slide's outlining here. The FDA, as the US regulator, has made very clearly their position in terms of what their expectations are. If we look at the history, in 2018, they issued their first version, nope, 16, they issued their first version, it was like 8 pages. 18 had an update that was like 20 pages. And just in April of this year, their update was like 50 pages long. So it's clear that they too are maturing their perspective in terms of what the expectations are. And so these 6 items can seem like relatively straightforward things to do. The reality is when you translate it into the engineering process at a device maker, it can become pretty complicated to actually enable. A great example Tim just shared was this notion of unique token for each device. So think per serial number, right? A lot of times device makers used to use kind of IoT solutions that would say the equivalent to your thermostat, everybody gets the same key, everybody has the same authentication. We don't need to have one unique per serial number. And it kind of works in the consumer space because every 2.5, 3 years, something new comes out or it breaks and you get a new one. It doesn't work in hospitals that aren't going to replace a device just because it's a couple years past when it was supposed to work. If it works just fine, that thing persists, right? So you have these very specific requirements that are due to the healthcare use case. So we'll talk through each of these maybe in a little bit of detail here, and hopefully folks can ask questions as we go through it if they are unclear on what it means. So they make an explicit call out for design for security. So this notion is that your devices have to have consideration for how this interface is going to work in a hospital. So imagine you have a pump that's bedside, and to authenticate it, to manipulate some data, requires a 12-character long password that must have some combination of characters and special characters, right? That's pretty hard to enforce because you're in a healthcare setting. There are people that are having emergent issues and they have to be cared for imminently. As we talked about, patient safety is kind of at the core of what device makers are meant to do. They're here to deliver some sort of clinical intervention. And if we make it harder to do that, that's not really solving it from a security perspective or from a use perspective. So we really have to think about how can security work with the use case of a device and how can that be enabled and sustained so that folks don't just bypass it and stick a Post-it on the pump and then start working their way around that.
Exactly. You know, having a 12-character long password in a healthcare setting like that, all that really enables people doing is setting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and as precision of easy to put in and quickly put in characters and stuff like that. So you might as well not even have anything at all, or putting it on the side. Everything has to be kind of taken in consideration, both the user interface and what are you going to achieve with security, because even if you could shorten it to 6 characters, but it's much easier to get in, and you don't have people creating these super simple passwords or writing them down. That is better than what you had with the 12 character, just because people are going to have those bypasses to do it. And that's really kind of critical, thinking about it holistically within the whole system to make sure that you're not obviating the usefulness of your security by making it so complex that no one's going to use it that way.
I think a great analogy here is we all have some sort of smartphone, and the frequency with which you're getting a security update and it's patching itself and you have no idea that it's even happening is demonstrative of the ability to make it really user-friendly if you do it with intentionality. You shouldn't have to think about kind of how you maintain the security of the device if it's been sufficiently designed into it.
Right. And one thing that I think is emphasized or not emphasized enough is the notion of designing with security as your number 1 or number 2 priority. I think a lot of startups, they're under a lot of pressure to deliver a proof of concept, to validate that everything works, and then because of maybe funding, maybe time, they just keep going with that proof of concept and improving it. But it wasn't designed from the beginning to have that security built in and be a primary driver of the design considerations. So what you end up getting then is you bolt on a lot of stuff at the back end of everything, and that doesn't work. You get into a lot of regulatory issues. The FDA, that it's become very apparent that this is, as Vidya said earlier, the latest guidance, draft guidance that was issued in April is 50 pages long, and it's extremely extensive. And if you're not doing those things from the beginning, you're going to fall behind very quickly and get a lot of pushback, and now you're stuck in that every 90-day review cycle because they noticed something else that you didn't do. And this kind of goes hand in hand with implementing design controls. Design controls and security should kind of be like this. If you're doing one, you should absolutely be doing the other, and to really make sure that you're moving forward with those as the top line considerations.
One of the I giggled there because you say as startups they stick with the same design. It's true of large device makers that are building their next gen, right? 80% of the code base copy paste. Nobody knows what it does, but it works. So why touch it? And then let's just add on the new features that we want. So it's definitely pervasive, I think, in the whole industry and the way we design devices. Rightfully so, right? Why would you trade clinical innovation for something else that you don't understand? So I understand how we got here, but we certainly need to be a little bit more intentional. Tim alluded to the fact that the scope of the guidance with devices in particular. So this version of the guidance that came out explicitly calls out these pre-market devices. So it used to be that it was just the 510K type of submission that required it, but we're seeing for PMAs, for IDEs, all these kind of you just have 10, 12 devices in the field for clinical purposes, needing to demonstrate some intentionality around cybersecurity. And that's a huge deal for folks who are just starting out with their kind of journey towards building a mature device.
Absolutely. And just making sure that you're considering that, and even every aspect of your design, alluded to either UI, UX is just as critical for doing this stuff as the actual software that's running within the firmware that's running in the device. Being able to deliver firmware updates, that's become a critical aspect of the FDA's focus as well, particularly with the swin tooth vulnerability. That became very apparent to them that everybody needed a mechanism to update their devices, or at least a plan. If you're going to be mailing out USB keys to every customer, I guess that's acceptable, but that has its own security problems too. A lot of, unfortunately, and this goes way back, but when zip disks, there was a vulnerability that the manufacturer had where it was writing a virus to the boot sector of every one of those, and you'd put it in and your computer got infected. So distributing physical media anymore is very problematic for just that reason. There's a lot of things that can happen between manufacturing it and then sending it out. So securing the devices that way, and then with the firmware, and then communicating it to a cloud service. Is everything being encrypted in that way and stored encrypted? So those are a lot of considerations that you need to make sure you're doing as well as you design your product.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, perhaps it's not obvious when you get into a hospital setting, the folks responsible for maintaining the security of the devices or updating or patching, whatever, are also often responsible for maintaining their enterprise email server, right? These aren't people dedicated to device management. They're most obviously capable of keeping devices uptime and making sure that they're available for use. And a hospital, especially in the last couple of years, has really proven that they are under constraints in terms of delivering care, and they have to be focused on delivering patient care versus anything else. And I think those looking for the opportunity see this as a clear gold mine, because there's a lot of divided attention, and a lot of studies have recently come out that said even after a hospital undergoes some sort of ransomware attack, for up to I think 3 years after that, they suffer reduced capabilities because their focus is just distracted. They're trying to do too many things and trying to change too much at once, and not everyone is a giant health system that can afford to have a 50-person cybersecurity team to maintain that.
And that goes exactly what you end up happening in those situations. You don't have dedicated IT security professionals. So as part of the cleanup for something like that, you're sending some people to training, they're coming back and they're like, we need to do all of this stuff. And all of that stuff is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take years to implement. So, even though technology is evolving very rapidly, IT is no more different than any other industry where change actually happens very slowly because of cost, because you want to make sure you don't have interrupted service or anything like that. So, depending on that hospital's IT department to keep all your stuff, secure as well, that can be very problematic. It wouldn't surprise me if you're seeing devices that are a year to year and a half out from the latest version of any software, just because a typical hospital may have 500, 600 of a devices of a heart monitor, or an insulin pump, or any type of bedside equipment like that. It's a huge effort just to go around and update and touch every single one of those and track every single one of those.
And this isn't even accounting for this kind of meta trend we're seeing in healthcare, where devices are going home with patients, especially in the pandemic. The notion of delivering care remotely or having someone be remote hugely took off. And I don't think that's going to diminish over time here, where we're kind of in a position where people like getting care from home. They don't want to go in if they don't need to. So how do you tell someone with a glucose monitor in their house that they have to flash the firmware on it? It doesn't seem like a reasonable ask, right? Like, we really have to consider how this thing is going to be used in the hands of the patient, in terms of how we design security for them.
Right.
And to that point, it's an interesting notion that the FDA included that second bullet around post-market in their pre-market guidance. You'd think, well, does that make sense? Like, it's related to once this device is already out, why should it be in pre-market? Because of exactly this scenario where it has to be maintained over time. And who's going to do that? And how do we enable that? Because we as device makers are the ones who have the most insight into how this device is going to work and how it needs to be updated.
Exactly, and that reminds me of a section in that new FDA guidance around threat modeling. That's a relatively new concept for healthcare devices. It's been around for quite a while in the IT field, but they are expecting you to do a threat model for every scenario where that device can exist. So if it's going home, all right, so what's it look like in the home environment? Who can attack it? Can you depend on it being behind some kind of firewall, or how is it communicating? Does it do any type of basic authentication via Bluetooth if there's an application involved? Those types of things are all critical for looking at how that device is going to operate in the environment it's going to operate in. If you're going from a hospital to a home care and it operates in both, I mean, that's a big deal. And they are definitely looking at both of those scenarios and quizzing people very heavily about it.
Yeah, so this notion, I think, of device makers having to be responsible for this device once it's out in the field, even if it's in the four walls of a hospital, is something I think device makers have historically not had to carry the burden of. I think if you take a typical scenario, a device goes down, hospital IT gets called, they try to fix it, they flash the firmware, reset the thing, send it back out, and hopefully it works for a little bit longer. When the device maker finally knows something went wrong is often well after the event. There's no logs left because it's all been wiped. And there's no intentionality around seeing if it was a security event. They're looking for operational data, perhaps rightfully so, but it really disenables a device maker from really figuring out if one of their security designs was problematic and how this thing was going to operate in the long term.
Yeah, I agree. Being able to see those logs timely and being able to have some sort of detection of just when something went wrong, centralized, is really critical to monitoring those devices. Now, to be clear, we're talking about hospital devices in hospitals or in homes. We're not talking about like class 3 implantables. I mean, those devices have been, I think the FDA has been maybe not as proactive as they needed to be, but they've definitely been pushing that much harder, much sooner. As far back as 2010, I can remember working Cyberonics, now LivaNova. They were very concerned with communication protocols and encryption around that. Because there was a lot of talk about how a cardiac pacemaker was just open to the world, and anybody could reverse engineer the communication protocol very easily and walk by and kill somebody. I don't know that actually happened, but I think it was a wake up for the industry in terms of that. But now, the latest generation of like at-home devices and these standalone devices that everyone is giving this connectivity to is kind of giving rise to this larger notion of, hey, we need to do security everywhere all at once. And
go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So this idea of has this really happened, right? You alluded to the fact that I don't know if it really got exploited or not. This is a real challenge in our industry because we're not looking for this data. If you ask the FDA objectively today, show me a body associated with the cybersecurity event, they will say it has not occurred. But the reality is when these people get rerouted because they can't deliver care, or when there's a delay in getting an MRI, you perhaps have a suboptimal outcome for a patient. These things actually have ramifications for clinical outcomes. We just don't have the data to justify it. And I think at this stage, given 2021 seemed like the year of ransomware, I don't think we could fight anymore and say that there isn't an impact when clinicians just can't operate and they can't even open the doors to the hospital because of cybersecurity incidents. And so it's a fascinating challenge when folks try to make the case for prioritizing cybersecurity and devices and making the investment to try to address these things when you can't physically point to something and say this is where we saw that loss.
Yeah, and I think that incident in Dusseldorf was really kind of an eye-opener because they can directly tie it together, and the fact that it was made public, that's I think hospitals are like any other, people who run hospitals are like any other human beings. Something tragic like that, they want to minimize kind of the PR around that, but they were very open and honest and said, yeah, we had to refuse this patient, and unfortunately she died later on because we weren't able to take her immediately like that. And so that's that kind of thing is critical, just being transparent in and of itself. And it's difficult to sort of face that, I think, for a lot of organizations, but we need to develop that kind of mindset in order to, because when everybody knows about something, it drives the thinking in the right direction of, hey, we need to start thinking about how we can secure all of this stuff to make sure that we're not preventing patient care. And you may find vulnerabilities that you didn't even know you had. Going back to the swin tooth example, there were so many devices that people didn't even realize were vulnerable to that, and it took an extensive amount of communication because some of these Bluetooth module makers were like, no, it doesn't affect us. And in the case of my former company that I worked for, we actually did testing and discovered it was. We had to hire a third party to actually do the testing to figure out, yes, this is vulnerable, because the manufacturer wouldn't give us any information. So, all of that comes into play. You have to be constantly looking at all this stuff, monitoring various channels to see, what's the latest thing going on. If you're building software is not a static thing anymore. You can't just build it once, throw it out there, and pray for the best. And that was a mindset 20 years ago where I saw this a lot, where you would install a set of software, and even though there may be updates, minor updates, you may do those, but going major version to major version was such a large amount of work that we're just going to stay where we are and we're not going to do it. And 10 years later, why does this software keep breaking? How did we get hacked? Well, you're running 10-year-old software with all these vulnerabilities. So, constantly updating, consistently doing that rigor, looking at those types of frameworks and seeing what the updates there and incorporating it and testing it. It's a lot of work. It really is, but it's worth it because you have the mindset of constantly addressing vulnerabilities and things as they present themselves.
So I think this is partially why this vulnerability management, or the idea of even knowing what's inside your software and keeping track of it for vulnerability disclosures, has gotten so much airtime in the last year and a half. Biden's executive order last summer, the DoD, the VA, all these entities basically saying thou must be transparent in how your software is built and what's in it, and tell us when something happens, I think has really gained a lot of momentum. Now, right or wrong, I know there's a lot of drama around SBOMs in general, but the idea of actually tracking it and knowing if you're impacted is precisely why things like WannaCry are so problematic. Because when WannaCry happened in 2017, FDA was calling people saying, hey, are you impacted? Folks were like, we don't even know what version of anything we're running. Like, should we be tracking that? Is that important? And it's a real challenge because the engineers that built that thing have moved on to the next project, right? There's no business model in the device maker that enables you to really go back and deal with cybersecurity. Your R&D teams build the device, they get it out the door, and then they move on to the next thing. So it becomes a real challenge within device makers to really justify this investment. And it often asks the question, where's the bottom line impact on this? You're telling me we avoided a theoretical, but you can't prove that that was ever really going to happen, right? So why should I make this choice?
Yeah. And the new guidance that we're talking about that came out in April, SBOMs are a huge section of that, and it is critical. There's things, we maintain an SBOM for the Galen cloud, and things like the Log4j vulnerability, as soon as that came out, we knew we weren't vulnerable because we knew we weren't using that in anywhere in our stack. So we were able to reassure customers within 30 minutes that, hey, we're not using that, you're clear with that. And those types of things become more and more critical as these zero-day exploits become more and more prevalent. It used to be security researchers had months to research it and work with the owners, and now there are people who find these vulnerabilities and they're trying to sell them as fast as they find them, just for the same reason that they're stealing information.
And I think it used to be really idiosyncratic. It was, I'm going to target this singular device, this single component, and this one thing. Now it's, hey, let me just go for the broadest reach possible and go as low level, far up the supply chain as I possibly can to impact not just healthcare, but pick your industry, right? That there's a new one, it feels like every 10 days, and we're all kind of scrambling to figure out what to do next. So it makes sense that vulnerability management has a huge footprint here. It'll be interesting to see the implementation. As I alluded to before, this collaboration between device maker and hospital is required for this thing to work, right? Because hospitals don't always let the device maker know when they've updated. Device makers don't always know if the hospital has updated something. And so you're in this kind of communication conundrum of whether or not things have actually been resolved or whether they could have been exploited for a period of time.
Exactly. So being able to, as online communication for these devices become more and more prevalent, being able to keep track of that, being able to say, hey, 90% of my devices are on this version of the firmware and 10% are on this, and that 10% is vulnerable. We need to force those, develop a program for notifying the end users of that 10%, hey, you need to make sure this happens. That's all part of it as well. And going into the documentation, documenting all of this as you're going through and you're finding vulnerabilities, document, because I think my personal opinion on this is the FDA is going to start looking at this very heavily, showing, did you actually address these vulnerabilities in a timely manner? Can you prove it through your design controls? When did you find out? When did you start doing something about it?
There was a very fascinating inclusion in this latest guidance around metrics, which is the first time the FDA has asked for this thing, which speaks exactly to that. How long did it take you to determine if you were impacted? How long did it take you to release a patch? Historically, when device makers have had open forums with the FDA, they've said, look, it takes me 6 months to get through V&V. How can I possibly address this in a timely manner? And the FDA has said, it shouldn't take you 6 months to get through V&V. Like you should figure out how to get the security stuff prioritized within how your quality system works. And I think that's a huge part of this documentation bit, is feeding in cybersecurity requirements into the QMS of device makers. That's how we develop devices in the medical industry, right? Like that is the golden standard by which everything reflects and how you're able to track completion. And I think embedding security into that is absolutely a way to go, and will force a lot of this documentation to happen before the device is even out the door.
Absolutely. So let's move on to what the outcome of all of the not doing any of this stuff is. The fiscal risks around not designing for security and not using design controls and all that. So there's the obvious, the fines for breaches. HIPAA, both HIPAA and GDPR specify some pretty hefty fines for every time data is exposed. The big thing I don't think a lot of people realize is the regulatory setbacks that are part of all of this, and then just maintaining your data integrity. There's a lot there that you have to make sure, hey, can I actually depend on this data for doing anything meaningful? Does it really represent someone's blood pressure? Is this really it, or has someone gone in and rewritten the database, and now someone who blood pressure's 200 over 120 and is about to die, it's reporting they're at 90 over 60 and they're just fine. That's an extreme example, but it's still a valid concern.
I have a great anecdote here. There's a large device maker who had sold a surgical robot into China, and the way their business model worked is they would pay per procedure. Someone being creative in that environment decided to bypass the count that was actually happening there and overwrite the security check that was in place for it. And they were able to only pay for one operation per day, when in reality, this device was being used probably 17 times in that day. And this directly impacts your bottom line, right? If your business model is contingent on confidence in what your device is doing, and you don't have that anymore, you're kind of in a difficult spot. the complement to that is, imagine if you could start selling your giant capital equipment device and having a lease strategy, and then you're paying by procedure, and have confidence in what that number really is. You could probably enter a whole new market and a whole new business model for what your device could do if you did it strategically and with security in mind.
Yeah, and I mean, I think everybody understands the whole thing around breaches. That's pretty self-explanatory, and we've been dealing with that for a fairly long amount of time. But the regulatory setbacks is something that I'm not sure that everybody really appreciates how extensive the FDA is getting on these questions. If you're not doing the threat modeling, you're not doing end-to-end verification, which includes all of the security aspects of it, the FDA is very willing to kick your application back and say, well, go fix this, and we'll put you into review, another 90 or 180-day review when you resubmit those changes. And by the way, if you don't have everything that we're looking for, we're going to reject it again and go through that. It's not uncommon now. What I've heard is anywhere from 6 months to a year in delay of getting your device approved because these companies didn't do everything that they're really looking for around documenting these things, documenting security, documenting threat modeling, all of that stuff. Even though this is a guidance, I still feel they're kind of already looking that way to make sure people are doing it.
I think it's a common fallacy to say, hey, it's guidance, it's not real, it's not final. The guidance is reflective of their current way of thinking, right? That's their definition of what guidance is. So they are viewing any submission in the light of what this expectation is. Now, are they going to hold you point for point to it? Probably not, but they are going to have a mature perspective in terms of, hey, did you set your keys to have a 30-year life? Well, that's not reasonable, because this device needs to be able to relinquish and reprovision keys as appropriate, right? And I think their maturity, much like how device makers have matured in their position, is also going up really fast. And they've asked for those who watch the FDA budget requests, they've asked for a 10x increase in their budget. One can imagine this is to increase enforcement and transparency and what their expectations are, and really get to that point where device makers are needing to demonstrate, and the burden is kind of on them to show and convince the FDA of what that is.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, so I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I think my last thought there would just be, no, you're fine, is that understanding the business risk for a device is almost as critical as designing security in a meaningful way, because that will enable you to sustain it as a security posture that's imperative to the business operation over the lifetime of the device. And we all know devices last a lot longer than we ever planned for, so it's definitely critical.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
So Vidya and Tim, I have a few questions. So with the FDA, Vidya, you mentioned at the very beginning, right? I feel like cybersecurity was new for a lot of people, or it got more popular, right? It wasn't maybe new for coders or anyone in the IT industry, but for in a general sense, it got more popular. The FDA, from what I understand, what I've heard from other people, is that they did a pretty good job of bringing in industry experts in order to help them kind of craft some of their cybersecurity guidances and that sort of thing. I guess one, what was your take on that process? And this is for both you and Tim. And two, was that helpful that they pulled in those kind of folks? Was it very collaborative? I feel like the FDA has some wounds that from other guidances they've done where they've kind of just said, hey, this is how we're doing things. And then it kind of like pitted them versus the industry. But from my understanding, it wasn't like that with this.
100% agreed. I think we all perceive the FDA as this like behemoth of an organization. The reality is there are very specific 3-4 people that were tasked with building this cybersecurity guidance out. Any device maker has a relationship with them. They've had multiple town halls. They've had patient engagement conversations where they've really tried to understand what is the reality of security and what can meaningfully be accomplished and sustained. Because I think that there's a recent legislation in Congress right now about forcing the FDA to do this on a more frequent basis and update the guidance more regularly. And it's kind of almost at odds with how the FDA needs to do this, because to do this constructively and get feedback from the folks that actually are responsible for it, the timeline Congress is calling for wouldn't work, right? Like you just be in a position where you're developing something for something that's now outdated because you already updated it, and you didn't update it in a way that understood the community. I think part of this stems from the fact, to your point, connectivity was not intentional in healthcare, right? We're like, oh, let's put a USB drive on this thing and see what happens. Oh, let's put an Ethernet cord on this and see what happens. Oh, that could be interesting. And now it's ubiquitous. And the curve to get that mature wasn't really something we planned for, right? So we didn't really have that maturity for a long time. And the FDA's regulatory model is based on pills. They don't know how to deal with this constantly changing thing. So they too have had to change.
Yeah, and you know, back in 2010, I remember they issued a draft guidance that was disastrous. I mean, everyone was like, this is completely unrealistic. Where did you come up with this? You know, this is a pipe dream. And I think they learned their lesson from that. And this latest guidance was very collaborative with the industry to make sure that this is, you know, follows kind of best practices and wasn't so onerous that it's sort of like the 12 character password thing. Like if I can't really implement that, so I'm just gonna, you know, do this little part and cross my fingers and hope no one notices. You know, regulations don't work if that's what you're hoping for. They should be realistic, and they should implement, you know, the current thinking. And you know, I think the FDA really did a good job with this latest guidance, collaborating to get to something that is realistic and meaningful.
Okay, so there's the FDA. There is one question I want to get to too, but the other thing I had is there's the regulatory FDA side of things, right? And then so you have to comply, right? You have to do these things in order to have your medical device be on the market. But then there's also the commercialization, getting into a hospital side of things. And you know, I guess the way I look at running a medical device startup company is like the FDA is a checkbox, but selling your product, getting into a hospital, this is the true test, right? And so you could expect, I feel like a lot of people sit here and say, okay, well, the FDA is making me do this. Well, wait till you try to get into a hospital system. So from your standpoint, you know, the preparation of cybersecurity early, you know, does that help? How does it change once you start, you know, working with a hospital and trying to now comply with their IT and their cybersecurity? Maybe just some perspective there, because I can tell you the first time this happened for a client we were supporting, it caught us off guard. You know, we walked into a room that was supposed to be a value analysis committee that had 25 people from IT sitting in there, and so it is daunting. And so I'm just curious on your guys' take on that.
Yeah, I definitely think there was a period of time where the chief of surgery would be at the top of the desk pounding, saying, this is the device I want. And they would get it, right? Regardless of what the IT impact of that was. I think in the last 5 to 7 years, you've seen a maturity from hospitals because they're the ones operating in the red. They're the ones getting held up for ransomware. They're the reputational risk at the end of the day. And on average, I'm seeing about a 6-month time cycle for assessment of IT. If you don't have a clean, tight story when you walk in the door, a 6-month delay in sales can be detrimental to your ability to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting into a hospital, particularly with connected devices, is even more complex now because, you know, we alluded to this earlier when we were talking about it, where, you know, they're responsible for maintaining this equipment. So because of that, you know, they're I think going maybe a little too far in doing vulnerability testing and all that stuff, but ultimately it works for the betterment of the hospital system. You know, they're trying to make sure they cover all their bases and that you have a device that's actually secure. So, you know, but yeah, 6-month lead time is not at all unusual. And even getting on a hospital's Wi-Fi network is a nightmare. A lot of companies now I see are going to cellular-based devices just so they don't have to deal with that nightmare of trying to connect to a hospital's Wi-Fi, which is pretty amazing, because the cost involved and the certification and everything, just putting a Wi-Fi cellular device in your device is not a small task.
And those 5G cards are they're becoming more and more popular, but I don't think people are sufficiently thinking about what it means for them downstream in terms of maintenance and monitoring these things over time. But it's an interesting pivot, right? We're exactly to the point. Cybersecurity, when done with a different way, you choose a different mode of connectivity, you potentially have a whole new mechanism to manage.
Cool. One of the questions we got in during the registration process, and you may have answered it, but I want to ask it anyways to see if you want to expand on anything, was on what criteria risk should be demonstrated or considered. I think they might have mixed up some words there, but.
So I guess my initial reaction to that is the core thing here is patient safety. The intentionality around this guidance is that you're able to deliver your clinical intervention in whatever capacity that is. So I think that's the framework around which a lot of the FDA's thoughts have been developed or derived. That being said, there's definitely reference to tons of missed guidances and that sort of thing in the guidance document itself that you can point to. And I know there was some criticism from folks that the latest version had less demonstrative, like do A through F. But I think that the guidance certainly points you in the right direction when it comes to how to frame some of these risks. The big thing that I thought was interesting in this was this multi-system view. So the idea that if I can take down a single version of your device, does that then mean I can take down all 10,000 of them across the network or whatever ecosystem you're in, right? And that to me is probably one of the more novel things that they call out explicitly in this version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, risk should always be patient-centric. Risk is a hierarchy. You start at the patient level, and then you may go to a systematic level of the hospital if you're doing hospital connectivity or home connectivity, which, you know, in consideration, but always start at the top with patient-centric and drill down from there. The idea of doing the end-to-end, so if one device is compromised, are all the devices compromised? This kind of goes back to the notion where a lot of manufacturers were embedding a single communication key in all their devices because, you know, manufacturing devices is hard, and doing that type of individualization can be very difficult, particularly if you're using a contract manufacturer who isn't used to doing that type of thing. It's getting better, but still, you know, there was always that temptation. I just want to make it work and I don't want to have to worry about it. Well, that's coming back around and getting addressed with all of this.
And I think a lot of startups rightfully try to use experts to do this stuff, right? You get an expert manufacturer to build this one thing, fine, that's one less risk I have to worry about. But as a result of that, are you able to do asymmetric key encryption per serial number, or are you stuck with keys that can't be cloud connected because your manufacturing facility is not cloud connected on purpose? And so I think this notion of using third parties to do stuff, while appropriate for the most part, still requires some level of owning that risk and saying, hey, at the end of the day, we have sufficiently considered the totality of this in a way that is focused on our clinical intervention.
Okay. We did get one other question come in. How can manufacturers streamline hospital IT requirements for SOC2, et cetera, with FDA guidance?
Go ahead.
No, I bumped my mic. I'm sorry.
All good. So this is a lot of what I did in my last gig, actually, was focusing on how do we tell our story to the hospital. The SOC 2 is a great mechanism when you talk about perhaps patient-specific data or PHI or PII, that sort of stuff, and how you're going to tell that story. A lot of it tends to focus more on one subset of security. It doesn't necessarily speak to the posture of the device itself. It tends to be more about the data that you're getting. Most hospitals will require a SOC 2 of some sort for the most part if you're touching sensitive information. What I would say though is balancing yourself against the NIST cybersecurity framework is probably a good start in terms of how you demonstrate that. To be totally transparent, there's no one tick the box that you can say to get into a hospital, right? They haven't said this is the one standard that we believe. And I think there's no two devices that are the same either. So you're also in a position where you have to tell kind of what works based on how your device is actually going to operate.
Yeah. And this is where certifications like HITRUST really come into play for service providers like Galen Data, because it's a security framework that covers SOC 2, it covers ISO 27001, it covers NIST, all of those things. So, you know, going in with that type of thing, that type of certification says, hey, we've done the work, we understand what the regulations are, and you know, we're willing to back that up with what we do every day.
To be honest, I think a lot of that is also a lot of the FDA's maturity here is to drive exactly that, right? If you can confidently say that you got through the FDA's new process in a way that is sustainable, I think that hospitals appreciate that and understand what that actually means now.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that some of these hospital systems, I mean, if they've been hit in the past, I'm guessing they're probably a little more cautious with this. They're, you know, do you think that plays a big role? Are they, you know, more cautious than the FDA? Are there more barriers? I mean, again, I'm only asking because I don't understand the space as much. Like I'm not new to cybersecurity, so like with strictly like safety of medical devices, right? I used to tell companies just generally, if you wouldn't give this to a family member, then you shouldn't be selling it, right? Like if a family member wouldn't use this or you wouldn't use this yourself, you shouldn't sell. That's a pretty good barometer. That's better than the FDA. It's better than anything else, right? Cybersecurity, what is that? It's like a moving goalpost almost sometimes with these hospitals, I'm guessing.
It's just a moving goalpost in general. I mean, it's not just the hospitals, it's everybody. It's,
Yeah.
the last thing you want to hear on the news is your device or service were compromised, and uh, millions of people aren't getting their insulin because their insulin pumps have been hacked or something like that. So, hospitals, I think, people are human. If they've been burned before, they're going to be more cautious, and maybe sometimes to the point of maybe you're going a little overboard in the view of what this particular regulation means. And I've seen that, like, no, we're doing this to the letter, and well, we meet the spirit of this, not necessarily down to that decimal point or whatever, but that's just the human nature. I don't think that that's anything that we can regulate, or you just have to mitigate with going in knowing, hey, I meet all of this stuff. I'm doing all of this stuff every day to make sure that this is secured. And you just have to have those ducks in a row when you have that conversation.
That being said, I think hospitals are getting smarter with how they do this. Just recently, the HSCC came out with hospital legal contract language, so that, sure, if you're the Mayo Clinic, you might have a 50-person team that can help you build this thing. If you're a community hospital, you may not have those same resources, right? So they're now sharing and collaborating amongst themselves to say, hey, if you are taking a connected device, here's some legal mitigations you can put in place if something goes wrong. Which, if you're a device maker, that should wake you up pretty quickly, right? Because you're not going to sign away some percentage if you're having a cybersecurity incident and you have no idea how to plan for that. So I think they too are maturing in how they share data across the platform, and I think we're going to see more and more of that as these health systems continue to be in the red, kind of.
Mm-hmm. So another question I have, just based on like targeting of where these ransomware or where these attacks happen, right? Are they focused around larger institutions or cities, or are they could they be in like like a rural community? I mean, are there any patterns that you're seeing when you're looking at all this? Just out of curiosity, because I don't know.
I think the pattern comes more from security maturity, as it were. That they're not necessarily saying, the Dusseldorf's a great example. They were actually targeting the academic institution associated with the hospital. They accidentally took down the hospital. They were trying to make it come back, and they didn't know how to undo what they did, right? So I think that's a great example of intentionality or lack thereof by the hacker community. You don't see them necessarily trying to go after the Mayo Clinic just because it's the Mayo. I think they're going after whatever place they have an opportunity to enter through. And they're not necessarily going to run their scheme immediately. A lot of times it's wait and see when the opportunity presents itself to actually take advantage of that vulnerability.
Yeah, it's very opportunistic. And I mean, size does imply the bigger you are, the bigger target you are. And I think, larger organizations probably do get scanned or targeted more frequently, but that doesn't mean that they're going to bypass some community community hospital that they think they can make a dollar off of. Just be, well, it's a community, we should ignore that. No, they can make money off it, they're going to do it.
Yeah.
I will say, when the pandemic first hit and everybody locked down, the hacker community did come out and say, hey, we're going to leave healthcare alone for a little bit because y'all seem to have a problem. And then 9 months later, they were back in full action. So clearly didn't last.
No.
It didn't last too long. Yeah, I appreciate what you guys had to say today. I certainly learned a lot. I will say there's one missing piece to this, and he's been on a previous Galen data webinar series. His name's Mike Cremines. I think he was on. I haven't looked at the attendees in a little bit, but he's with Highland, and the one nice thing that kind of brings us in is like, okay, great, we just learned about all of this. well, how do we evaluate this risk at a company level, and how do we cover that risk? There's things that we can do here, and there's also things that we have to do externally. And so actually, this was the inspiration for one of our panels at our event in October in Houston, Texas, through Project MedTech, was how do you evaluate cybersecurity risk at a company level, and how do you address it, right? I thought you guys covered a lot of that today. So for those who are watching, if you have further questions on MedCrypt or Galen, their contact information is right there. Info@medcrypt.com or hello@galandata.com, which I love the hello instead of the info. That's awesome. But other than that, thank you all so much for joining. And we will have the September one probably later this week. It'll be in later September, but we'll have our next Galen Data webinar series as well with our next topic. So thanks so much for joining. Vidya, Tim, thank you so much for educating us and not scaring us too much.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dwayne.
everyone.
And Vidya, thank you.